on to our next topic. So I think you both have mentioned the topic around narrative. I'm curious, how do you shape the narrative around board metrics? And maybe you could pick one metric and talk about that, or just in general, that process of shaping the narrative. Lauren, what can you share with us?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, again, I think in the first place, you start with the end goal in mind, because every company has a goal sort of in the next couple of years. And whether it's to get to a certain size, early stage, and, the sort of West Coast triple, double, model.
2D3.
Exactly. Whether I can't say it that quickly, because if I do, then I switch over to RT.
2D2.
What is it? RT. Too much Star Wars in my background. It's, if that's your goal and that's what your board's expecting, then that's how you figure out the narrative that you're telling. If the narrative, and that's something that really the CFO together with the CEO have to define, and working with the board, depending on, the structure of the board, whether they have a really close board where they're working very closely together, or whether there's a little bit of friction between the goals of, because you can have situations where you have a board with different investors on the board, and some of those investors may have different goals for the company than other investors, and also for the CEO. So it's a tricky situation, but that has to be defined at that level. And the CEO and the CFO have to work with the team and figure out, okay, this is what the story that we're trying to tell. I don't think that can come from, the bottom up. I think it has to come from the top down. And then you carve out the metrics that tell that story. I think referring back to Kaitlin's comment of sometimes you define metrics for the board differently than you define them for the company. I think in the best of all possible worlds, you have the same definitions. You may have different targets that you give the board than you give the company internally. I used to know a VC who'd been a CEO of a couple of companies who said he always had 3 different, sets of company numbers. One that he would, the numbers you give the board, you have to make those numbers absolutely no matter what happens. That is like your, stake in the ground. The numbers that you set as a management team maybe can be a little bit more aggressive. And then the numbers that you give, the sales organization, that's kind of a traditional way of doing it. But other companies are just completely transparent. There's a great model to that as well. So yeah, different models work for different cultures of companies.
Yeah, I think we certainly see that with, budgeting or quotas, that internal number, or what's the bank number, kind of thing. How about for you, Kate?
So, so same as what Lauren said, is that the story comes from the C-level. And I think what helps the people who are building the decks is being curious, is hearing that story and then going into the data and really being curious about how we then look at that. And I think you always, if you're asking all these questions of like, okay, if this is where we're going, we need to talk, about, I guess the most common thing that is always a stressor is when you're trending in a great direction towards that goal. And then that one quarter it dips and it goes below, and you have to be able to tell why. And it's digging into that data and trying to look at it with all these different lenses to figure out, there's got to be a good story in there. It's not a great thing that it dipped. Also, if you're doing it quarterly over 2 years, like one dip is, you don't want to cause a fire either. You don't want it to be like set the alarms off and, we're down 3% and everyone, your hair's on fire. So you want to just start to ask the questions of like, obviously why we saw that dip, but let's start to look at this data a little bit differently than we're used to. Let's get really curious and say, all right, are we looking at it new versus expansion? Are we looking at it by region? Are we looking at it by vertical? Are we looking at it by product? Because then you start to find answers that you probably haven't been reporting on, and that you probably will start to look at going forward. And you're realizing things that is it a competitor that's in there that hasn't been showing up lately or is now in there, or is, what exactly is that? But it's about, for the people who have to support the story, it's about being really curious about it. And, that ends up being, 25 pivot tables in Excel sheet, but like it gets you to the point where you're just starting to really look at your business a little bit differently. And the dip may have caused that, but it's always a good thing, because then it starts to be on your radar and it kind of shifts your vision a little bit. It doesn't mean you're always going to look at it that way, but it's really being curious, because you can also provide more of a narrative for that C-level, as you can say, actually, I found this out, and this, we may have had a dip, but this is actually a great opportunity for us. And like, here's the things that we can do to help get us back on track, or, it could lead to something else that ends up being really great. So like being curious about it as the people who have to go and find the answers is how I think we participate in that, in that narrative.
Yeah. Well, that's great. And you need to leave yourself time in the process that we just talked about. So if you're spending all the time cobbling the metrics together, you're not getting that time to sort of swim in the data and really think about it and what it's telling you about the business. That's so interesting. Well, thank you both for that.